guys, and welcome back to another episode of Change Wired podcast. My name is Angela Shorina. I'm your host, I'm your partner in change, your culture transformation and change leadership consultant, also executive leadership coach, fueled by behavioral science insights and methodology. And today we have another absolutely amazing guest that you're gonna love hearing from. Scott Young, a guest who spent the career at the intersection of human behavior and business transformation. Scott Young is on a mission to help leaders apply behavioral science ethically and effectively. What makes Scott fascinating isn't just his resume, and what's on Scott's resume is leading global research firms, advising Fortune 500 companies, working with some of the greatest behavioral science teams like Behavioral Insights team and BVA, Nudge Consulting. Now also Scott teaches at places like London School of Economics, UPenn, and Chicago Booth. Scott is also fascinating because of the mission he's on to bridge the gap between behavioral science and the business world, to help leaders close that all-important intent-action gap, where people don't just say things, they'll do something because they say those things. They change their behavior and do so consistently, and because of that, results follow. Scott is on the mission to show executives that culture isn't about some lofty values, big words, and things we aspire to be, but it's mostly about everyday, repeatable behaviors that shape results and business impact. In this conversation, Scott and I dive into why companies over-rely on communication and financial incentives, and what actually drives consistent change. We're going to talk about simple frameworks from behavioral science like COMBI and EAST, and how they can help leaders design better systems and environments where what's desired, what's strategized is also executed, bringing desired results. We're going to talk about hidden power of reducing confusion and creating psychological safety in the workplace to accelerate innovation, adaptability, adoption of new technologies and tools like AI. We're going to talk about how leaders can build a behavioral lens into their leadership and business toolkit, not to replace other things or replace strategy, but to make execution stick, become consistent, and drive the results that leaders strategize about. If you ever wondered why good intentions in companies or for you personally don't turn into consistent action, or how to nudge yourself and culture other people forward without waiting for years for yourself or people to change, so this episode is full of practical insights that you can start using today to start seeing shift, change, and results tomorrow. So let's dive in. Let's get wired for change with Scott Young. Thank you, Scott, for joining Change Wired podcast and dedicating some of your precious time that nobody gets more of to sharing your wisdom, your insights, your experience, your work with leaders who want to make a change, who want to create more positive impact, want to create more business results, and see behavioral science as a tool to be able to do that better. So thank you so much, and welcome to Change Wired podcast.
Thanks so much, Angela. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I certainly hope there's at least some kernels of wisdom that we can share or discuss together that'll be helpful for people.
Yeah, and you are so modest, I guess, and humble because you've done so much work working with some of the biggest behavioral science organizations in the world. And you also did quite a lot of work in business world, applying behavioral science, in bits and pieces and more as you progressed and seems on your journey. So what I'm saying is you have a lot value to contribute, and I'm just hoping to be able to get some of it out with good questions, I guess. And
Well, thank you.
yes.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. And again, certainly we'll try our best.
Yes, maybe to give our listeners a little bit more background, where did you start your journey is as relation to where you are today? I guess how did you
Sure.
land on using behavioral science in the world, trying to help leaders and organizations to achieve the impact that they want to achieve?
Sure. I guess if I'm going to simplify it, I'd say it's been kind of a three-step journey for me. The majority of my career, I was leading an insights agency, doing shopper and packaging research for many of the big consumer marketers, the Procter and Gambles and Unilevers and Kraft Foods of the world. And, if I'm going to summarize it really quickly, I'd say I really saw this gap very consistently day in and day out between claimed behavior and what people would tell us in interviews or focus group sessions or and so forth versus actual behavior when they found themselves in a supermarket or online making purchase decisions. And that always fascinated me. And, when I was in the research world, I really kept looking for more behavioral tools to understand some of these gaps
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. And long story short, circumstances came together that I ended up making a career transition ultimately from kind of applying behavioral tools in insights and research to actually applying, behavioral science more broadly across a lot of different business issues and challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent about 8 years or so at two organizations, one BVA Nudge Consulting, and then later at the Behavioral Insights Team or BIT. And
Mm-hmm.
really the commonality for me there was that I was primarily working with businesses, with private sector organizations, though the range of issues and sectors varied tremendously, from healthcare one day to technology the next day to transport or financial services the third day. And also very much differ from end user or consumer type issues to internal or employee or management issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a really interesting transition for me. And then the last year or so, I've kind of evolved away from working for an individual consultancy, really towards this larger mission of kind of trying to serve as a bridge between behavioral science world and the business world.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, on one side, helping business people ideally embrace and apply some of the learnings and insights from behavioral science in what they do, whether that's human resources or compliance or insights or marketing. And then on the other side, really trying to help behavioral scientists understand some of the dynamics of the business world so that they can be effective in that context, which is obviously a very different context than perhaps more academic research or longer term government policy related work
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, such a wide range of seems like challenges and sectors that you worked with, and I'm just trying to figure out like where to even approach such a vast experience. Maybe let's start. You mentioned somewhere that you wanted to be, as you just described, bridge between business world and behavioral science world, and you started describing this. I guess my first question is, in terms of business applying behavioral science, where do you see unique value of behavioral science when it comes to solving different business challenges? Let's say some challenges are obviously external, whether that's
Sure.
cost changing certain things about customer behavior, and some things are internal, changing culture, or some issues with again compliance, HR, etc. So maybe let's start with first, like where do you see behavioral science has this like unique value to help businesses solve different challenges?
Sure. Well, I, if you don't mind, I guess I'll start a little bit with the challenges themselves and then
Yeah.
hopefully get to where I see the unique value. I think, most of my career was indeed, focusing on consumers or shoppers or end users. But I will say that I think the longer I've been involved in the applied behavioral science world, the more interested and excited and optimistic I am about internal employee behaviors or organizational cultural issues. And I guess the reason I say that is that you just have so many more potential levers and points of communication and touch points with your own employees,
Hmm.
from incentive systems to internal communication to processes to physical environment or digital environment. That, I guess I come to the conclusion that, if you can't influence the behavior, positively influence the behavior of your own employees, what likelihood do you have to do that to end users who spend a fraction of their time with you and thinking about you and your products and services? So obviously, both I think there's potential value, obviously, in a multitude of issues.
Hmm.
But again, if I have to choose, in terms of where do I see the greatest opportunities, I guess I see them somewhat more internally, actually. And those are some of the projects I've been most excited about recently, in areas like compliance, cybersecurity,
Hmm.
internal issues around everything, really, from employee retention to productivity to teamwork. Again, I think there's just more points of contact and more opportunity. But to speak to maybe the larger question you asked, what's unique about behavioral science? I mean, I think we could all probably ramble for quite a while on this, but if I have to boil it down, I think the real sweet spot, the area where we can have the most impact is indeed in thinking about helping bridge that intent to action gap.
Hmm.
So situations where people would truly like to do the right thing, quote unquote,
Yeah.
but human nature and life get in the way. So compliance to me, or cybersecurity is a nice example of that in that, most people would nod their head and say, sure, I don't want to put information at risk. I want to do the right things. They're not looking to circumvent. But again, the intent is positive. We don't need to convince them as much as we need to help them and facilitate and essentially make the easy path, make the right path the easier path for them to follow. So I always look for those situations as the where I feel like it's the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak, and that a lot of our tools and methods can perhaps be most effective.
Hmm.
I hope that's helpful.
Yes. And, speaking of, for example, cybersecurity or compliance, where do you see, I guess, leaders tend to get it wrong trying to solve these issues? And where do you see like behavioral science can help them to avoid those issues or deal with them better?
Sure. Well, again, I don't mean to singularly stick with cybersecurity, but if we use that as an example, I think the common trap, well, is maybe twofold, I think. One, to think that, that technology is the answer in and of itself, and that,
Hmm.
it's just finding the right technology and we're going to be there without recognizing or acknowledging that, the real problem is almost always human risk, right? The fact that people may have wonderful tools available, but they're not using them.
Yeah.
And, I think the second challenge, particularly related to that area, is that you've got people making the rules and developing the procedures and so forth that are very knowledgeable and very aware, and it's second nature to them, and it's very hard for those folks to take on the perspective of someone who
Mm.
is less comfortable and less familiar and more likely to be frustrated or flustered. As hard as they try, and they may have very positive intent, it's just hard for you, if you're very knowledgeable at something, to develop a tool that works well for someone who does, who is not like that, who's not like you.
Yeah.
Um, but again, I think you could draw a pretty similar parallel, perhaps, to HR issues and compensation, where, maybe it's not a technical solution, but people think, oh, if we just optimize our incentive structures, and we get the right bonus system in place, that will solve every problem, without recognizing in that case that, people will tell you that that's what matters to them in many cases, but the reality is a lot of what matters is what's immediate and what's in front of them, and getting, the immediate positive or negative feedback that they get, the immediate reward that they get is often
Yes.
much stronger than something that's a year away. At the end of the year, I'll be rewarded.
Hmm. So what I hear, I guess it's just not maybe spending enough time to understand how human nature works. I don't know, psychology, how human behavior works in general, and just thinking that systems first, functions first, sort of assuming that humans are these rational agents who just do the logical things when we know, well, somebody who studies behavioral science or knows anything about psychology, that is not the truth, the state of
Yeah, I think
reality.
that's fair. I think we kind of default to, a rational model as fully explaining, human behavior, when, in our own minds, we know, of course, that's part of the solution, of course, but it's
Hmm.
not always, it doesn't tell the full story. And, again, as humans, we're very, very subject to, immediate stimuli, as I was mentioning,
Yeah.
immediate feedback loops, and also to social norms, what we see other people doing,
Hmm.
etc. So yeah, I think that's a lot of what's going on. And one point that I'd make, and I may have alluded to quickly, is that one of the problems is, if we ask people questions, and this is what I saw a lot in my research days, my insights days, unfortunately, they'll often kind of reinforce the wrong, misleading things. In other words, you ask people what matters to them, they're going to say, oh, what matters is my bonus, what matters is my
Hmm.
vacation, what matters is, etc. Very rational things. And they're certainly not lying to us. They're saying what they're conscious of. But
Hmm.
again, what they're less likely to articulate are a lot of the things that behavioral science teaches us about, again, some of what's easy and what's immediate and
Hmm.
what makes me smile, even if it's not a financial reward, things of that nature. So I think a lot of this is, again, just being a little careful about not taking too literally some of what we get when we ask people questions, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like, asking people about, do you care about healthy eating, health or fitness? And like, yes, I do. And then I end up watching, I don't know, Netflix, eating a ton of ice cream and not really moving much, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a socially correct, there's social correct answers as well. But again, even I think in most cases people are not lying. What they're
Yeah.
articulating though is intent. They're not
Yes.
articulating, you know, we still have that intent to action gap, whether it's in individual behaviors, but also in employee behaviors as well, collaborating with my colleagues, etc. So I think one thing I've learned is, it's not that we should ignore what people tell us or not
Hmm.
speak with them, but I think we do have to be pretty careful the kinds of questions we ask. And I think we also have to maybe place greater emphasis on observing behaviors and processes and getting at some of the things that are unarticulated. So the longer I do this, the more I believe in ethnographic or observational research. Not
Hmm.
with thousands of people, but often, with 8 or 10 people, we can start to see some trends and see what's getting in the way, perhaps.
Yes, it's, I read it somewhere also, like if you want people to really give you feedback about your product or something, give them to and ask them to use it and without, explanation, for example, for software or instead of again asking about their opinion, ask them to try it out. And again, views and observation is so much more than talking about this, the thing, the product, or of people's behavior. Of
Yeah, yeah, kind of observe first, ask questions later, so to speak, rather than
Yeah.
jumping into that or putting too much emphasis on what people say they want. It's a starting point, but it's only a starting point.
Yes, exactly. And perhaps if you could share some of the tools that you use to address those issues, like whether that's helping companies to maybe roll out better technology or solve some cybersecurity or compliance issues, like experiences that you have. What are some tools, strategies that you use to address some of these
Sure.
issues?
Well, I may be a little different than some behavioral scientists on this because, a lot of them like to create new tools or, they're looking for the more sophisticated tools, etc. And I actually come at it from a very different perspective in the sense that I'm a real fan of some of the simpler tools that are there, very much in the public domain, and the reason is that I think a lot of what I'm trying to do in most cases is get people excited and get them started to apply things to their own problems. So, a lot of what I do is not necessarily saying, give me a problem and I'll go away and come back in a month with a bunch of answers. It's, I want to essentially upskill folks and get them thinking this way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long-winded way of saying, I use tools like ComB, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very simple, but I think very powerful in getting folks to think more broadly about the potential barriers or the potential reasons somebody is not doing something.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we're marketers selling a product, and particularly if we're senior managers or leaders thinking about employees and our team members and what they're doing, it's just very easy to jump to a singular answer and say, oh, they're lazy. Oh, they're not being paid enough, for this, or, whatever it may be. And I think in many cases, the answers are more nuanced than that. Sure, there may be some people who are held up by one thing, but there may be other people who are held back by confusion, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and that's in many cases an easier thing to solve, right? you know, than changing the pricing structure of something or the incentive structure in an organization. So, I think that's an easy one or relatively easy one for people to grasp. And if nothing else, it can start them thinking more broadly and saying, wow, maybe there's 10 different reasons people aren't doing this, and I can't solve all of them, but I could solve three
Mm-hmm.
or four of them, and that might make a difference with 20% of the people, and that's a lot, 10% of the people. So that's one model I often try to use, just again to get people thinking more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, a second one, and again, it's not a very complicated one, is I do use the East
Yeah.
framework a lot. When we start to think about potential interventions or solutions. And, again, the beauty of it is that it is relatively simple. And you can start to pretty easily share examples around, what's an example of making something easier? What's an
Mm-hmm.
example of making something, attractive
Attractive.
or appealing or compelling? What's an example of a timely intervention, a socially
Social.
based, social norms based intervention? So again, these are clearly not the most sophisticated models in the world, but I think their power lies in their ability in people's ability to grasp them and start applying them to their own problems and challenges. And, the role I like to play, and I think we can play is kind of coaching rather than doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, having a leader or a team brainstorm together with these frameworks, and then you're there to help them and support them and answer questions and maybe point them towards some examples that have worked elsewhere.
Yes, yeah, thank you for sharing these models and just this idea that instead of giving answers, it's more about changing leadership thinking and mindset around like where the problem can originate from and what's maybe a different way of approaching that from the behavioral science point of view.
Exactly. I'm sure you've heard this before, but the idea of kind of a behavioral science lens, for lack of a better term. I do think
Yeah.
that's as good an analogy as I have about it, which is, basically what we're trying to do is give people an additional, I think, incremental way of looking at their problems, their challenges, or their opportunities. And I try to emphasize, a few things. One, this is indeed incremental. I'm not here to tell you that everything you've been doing is wrong or,
Hmm.
you know, a rational model of human behavior is stupid or something like that. Of course, there's reality and truth to a lot of these tools, but I'm trying to say, hey, there's an additional way, an extra dimension, and this dimension may point you towards some different kinds of solutions that could complement what you're doing.
Yes. It's and once a leader can see that there is a additional toolkit, additional reasons for certain behaviors or certain issues, then they can try out different things, right? Different methodology or like piloting different initiatives, which then you can observe if things improve or things don't improve, and then can make conclusions or create different model of solving problems. I guess it just it's additional toolkit of solving different problems and issues that a lot of leaders just not taught to just think and use.
Yes, I think that's fair. It's another tool or another tool in the toolkit or another
Yeah.
way of addressing things. And though it's interesting as you're talking about that, I think sometimes the barrier is that people are resistant to testing and learning. Um,
Hmm.
and that varies a little bit by culture, I think by organization. There are some organizations where it is very much, you know, test and learn mentality and failure is not viewed negatively. But there are other organizations where that's not comfortable for people and that's difficult. So I've been doing some work actually with some others, an article coming out in the near future about basically the idea of creating what I'd call behaviorally formed executives,
Hmm.
executives that are not behavioral scientists, but have kind of the core base of tools or mindset. And one of those tools is indeed this idea of a experimentation mentality. And again, that's not everyone. That's a learned skill as well. And I think again, influenced a lot by the culture in which people are working.
Yes, just like everything else is influenced by the culture, and that's I think also the whole idea of behavioral science that a human being, our behavior is always in the context of something, and that you behave or think the way or people behave and think the way they do because of the environment where they're in. And also, speaking about just creating executives or leaders who are more behaviorally minded, I think it reminded me of this fact in general. Like when you become a leader, you need to develop a toolkit which consists of many different like skill sets. For example, if you're a leader, you need to get better at communication. It might not be your like natural strengths and you don't need to become an expert in communication, but you need to some degree to have ability to communicate certain things,
Sure.
initiatives, right? To just shape culture and delegate, etc. So for me, having behavioral sciences, one of those skill sets is kind of the same. Like if you are a leader, you need to understand that too, because you work with human beings who do need to perform a lot of behaviors to make organization work.
Oh, definitely. And well, a couple of different issues that I think that come up there. I think one challenge with some business leaders, this I think a little more on the marketing side sometimes than other side, is they they've read a book and they think they know behavioral science, and then they're eager to run off and apply. But, they're applying bits and pieces in a sporadic manner. And that's a
Hmm.
challenge. I mean, it's a tough one in the sense that sometimes I think behavioral scientists are coming at it from a very opposite perspective of, you need to do it perfectly and, you know, randomized controlled trials, etc.,
Hmm.
which simply isn't realistic in most business environments. So, I think part of the art of applying this in the business world is kind of finding the right middle ground. Where can we kind of influence and hopefully have enough rigor so, that we feel like we're truly learning and not just throwing, heuristics and such out there randomly. But on the other hand, applying this in a way that's realistic because we're not going to
Hmm.
ask companies to stop and spend a year and wait just to learn, massive uh, massive studies in order to move forward. So, that's a tricky balancing act. And
Yeah.
I think it varies a little bit by sector as well.
Do you feel like AI can help with that? Applying behavioral science and other methodologies in the business setting or any setting really, like what I'm thinking about, right? Or when I talk to leaders, I'm like, well, now that you know that this thing exists, why don't you ask your AI agent or whatever AI technology you use how to apply what you just learned in your specific setting? Like,
Hmm.
what do you think about the AI now helping behavioral scientists or behavioral science-minded executives to implement it better?
Wow. Well, I guess a couple different things, and I'm not sure if it'll directly answer your question. And I guess I'd start with a caveat that, I don't view myself as the expert in that area. There are some people that are really at the cutting edge of the intersection of behavioral science and AI that I think are doing great pioneering work there. People like Sam Seltzer, Antoine Ferrer, and others.
Hmm.
With that said, I guess I see two or three things going on. I mean, on the one hand, I'm definitely at the core optimistic. I think AI, among other things, can help us develop more customized solutions. I felt like historically, to some degree, this field and I think other fields were more limited by the idea that, hey, we only have the capacity to create so many things. So at the end of the day, we're going to kind of throw these ideas out there with the full world of people, employees, customers, whatever it may be, partners. And, we know that it's going to only have an impact on 5% of the people, maybe, and, we'll declare victory. Whereas now, I do believe, between the intersection of data science and the ability to more precisely target and understand behaviors and barriers, and also AI and the capacity to just create so much content and specific customized interventions, there's really a better chance to have a different approach to things where, if we can identify this subgroup that has this barrier, we can provide this kind of customized intervention and message that's more likely to be effective with them. And then
Hmm.
a different subgroup, a different message, etc. And completely oversimplifying, but I feel like the capacity to do that's going to expand enormously, which is great. So that's kind of one big positive in my mind. I think the second, the big negative or hurdle, I guess I would say, I think is going to be adoption, especially employee adoption. A lot of the issues and challenges I'm hearing from organizations are, hey, we have this wonderful new AI driven tool,
Hmm.
but our brokers, our client support people, whatever, they're not really embracing it or they're reluctant to use it. And I think you have two barriers. I mean, obviously, you may have more than two, but I mean, you have two immediate barriers that come to mind, right? One is, look, um, you know, technology is difficult no matter what, right? People,
Hmm.
some people are more comfortable than others. There's human resistance to change. It doesn't matter. There's always going to be problems with people adopting and using new tools. But then in this case, you've got a whole other layer of people feeling threatened by those tools. Great, you want me to use this and it's ultimately going to replace me in one way or another, or replace half of my colleagues. And you can imagine that's a huge disincentive for anybody.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I'm maybe making an obvious point here, but I think there's just an awful lot of work to be done in different organizations about kind of redefining the relationship of humans and AI tools. And I think in many cases, showing the humans the path forward and giving them the comfort that they need to truly embrace and capitalize on some of the things that are available. Unless you truly have a model of let's get rid of all of our people and replace. If that's the model, I mean, I think there's larger issues going on societally, but I think that's a scary model, at least in the short term, because I do think, there's a lot of issues both internally and externally with customers that you still need, at least for the near foreseeable future, you need human beings to understand and interpret and apply properly. So I hope I made sense there, but I see that as a huge challenge. Otherwise, I think you're going to get a lot of wasted energy on, essentially developing tools that aren't used properly or fully,
Hmm.
or maybe in some cases automating the wrong things, as well, right? Automating things that shouldn't have, that don't need to happen, which is
Yes.
kind of a larger related issue, I think.
And speaking of these challenges, resistance, fear, have you worked with some of these issues? Do you maybe have ideas of how leaders can approach these barriers to embrace more AI technology where it makes sense?
Well, I think two things come to mind. I think if I'm going to speak generally, I think confusion of any kind serves as a much bigger barrier than we think it does. To me, in my experience across a lot of different sectors and companies, the moment people get confused about anything, any little element, they use it as an off-ramp. It's an
Hmm.
excuse, whether it's conscious or subconscious, it's kind of an excuse to not do something that's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And in some places and situations, people also have, they lack the safety, the psychological safety, or whatever you want to call it, to raise their hand and say, I don't understand this. So they're not necessarily
Yeah.
going to tell you, they're going to just simply not do what you want them to do and hope it doesn't get noticed versus, raising their hand and saying, well, this new thing is confusing to me. I don't understand what to do here, there, and the other thing. So I think energy spent really truly understanding those barriers and that confusion is really, really time well spent if you want to get people, if you want to move people from A to B in
Hmm.
almost any situation. So that's kind of the top of mind thing that comes to mind in terms of where I think maybe sometimes we take it for granted, but we really need to do more.
Yeah, you started speaking about this aspect of psychological safety, for example, for people to even feel comfortable to, I don't know, make mistakes or raise concern about their confusion or just maybe not understanding something. Have you worked on some projects or do you have yeah, some experience suggestions for leaders how to maybe shift culture? Like if they know that that might be the issue, maybe they did assessments and studies and know that, for example, psychological safety is low, right? And that can be affecting a lot of these things like adoption technology. Are there
Yeah.
any tools and tactics, yeah, from behavioral science that they can employ to make a shift towards more, for example, psychological safety, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest point that I'd make there is kind of almost reversing the model that I think most of us have in our minds, which is, there's this top level of culture.
Hmm.
And then, if we establish the right culture and the right, principles, then the right behaviors will follow. And that
Mm-hmm.
sounds logical. I mean, in theory, it makes sense. But I think the problem is often that leads to these very vague statements about culture. We're a caring organization, we're supportive of each other, whatever it may be, which are well intentioned. I'm not trying to say they're all BS or
Mm-hmm.
anything. I think when I talk about reversing the model, what I think we almost need to do a more bottom-up approach that's behave driven on specific behaviors and
Mm-hmm.
say, if we want to be a collaborative organization, these are the 5 behaviors that constitute what collaborative means in this context. And these are the 5 behaviors, or whatever it may be, we want our people and our teams to do regularly. And they may be very mundane. They may be,
Yeah.
saying thank you, following up, whatever it is. But I think that's a level that you can have impact because you can find ways to reinforce those behaviors and remind people and, give them
Mm-hmm.
smiley faces and rewards or whatever it may be, and then work upward from there, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of evidence as well that like when people do things that when they, like when they
Mm-hmm.
recycle, they start to care more about and they start to view themselves as people who care more about the environment, for example. So again, apologize. It might be a slightly long-winded way of saying I really think we need to work upward from specific behaviors and do some of the hard work of defining behaviors that
Mm-hmm.
are expected that add up to the things that we care about, these values and this culture. Because otherwise, I think what ends up happening is, we agree on very vague notions of culture and we nod our heads and smile and, and then nothing happens because it's very amorphous. Oh, we're
Yeah.
collaborative culture.
Yeah.
So anyway, in the context of mergers and acquisitions and culture companies and cultures coming together, I'd give that same advice. They come, leaders often like to start the top down 30,000 feet, but I think you need someone to kind of go from the ground up and say, this is how we're going to interact with each other. This is what's expected. This is what's rewarded and valued. And, in at a level that everybody can understand. Every
Yeah.
time I submit something, this is what I do. Every time I have a
Mm-hmm.
meeting, this is what I do. Every time I talk with a customer, this is what I do. And that's how you start to create a common culture.
Yes. And I'm so just happy to hear that because that's what also like in my work I'm trying to preach and promote and create different case studies around that. There is this not saying, but example that I think it's from research literature that if you want the person to like you, ask them to help you. Like,
Yeah.
for example,
Yeah. Yeah.
the more the person helps you, the more they start believing that they actually like you, because otherwise, why would they help you, right? I,
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of parallels to that, right? That get them doing the right thing, quote unquote, and then attitudes and beliefs kind of align with that versus, the classic model of, first let's win their minds and hearts and then,
oh,
behavior will automatically follow. And the reality is behavior doesn't automatically follow, not because people don't care or want to, but sometimes it's very amorphous what the right behavior is. And other times habits and familiarity patterns get in the way.
yes, and I do also believe that people become in what we habitually do. And if
Yeah.
you want, yes, and it's just confirmed by so much like research and case studies and just day-to-day lives of people, right? If you want to, I don't know, become, I don't know, a kind person, then just act kindly. I also, when I work with leaders, they sometimes say, well, on assessments, I'm not as empathetic as I'd like to be. Like, but I think that I am, right? I'm not sure
Sure.
why did that come up. I'm like, well, when you talk to people, how often do you ask them their opinion first, right? Their take on things first. Like, how does it land with them? How does it feel? And you very often find that the behavior does not follow. And so what ends up happening, yes, they'd like to be that, but behavior doesn't follow, and therefore they're not that person.
Yeah, and in that case, I think defining empathy, you and I might define empathy somewhat differently, but I think the important thing is to kind of come up with some behaviorally based definition of it and say, hey, these are again, the five things or whatever it may be that kind of add up to empathy. Because as per your example, my definition of I think I'm empathetic might not be your definition. So the more we can get there, and that's hard work because I think a lot of leaders are very comfortable at this high level of, again, collaboration, empathy, customer centricity, and whatever big
Mm-hmm.
terms.
Yeah.
And they mean it and they're well intentioned. But again, you get that confusion when it filters into what do I actually do? So, working from the bottom up, that's what a lot of what I've learned, I think, from behavioral
Mm-hmm.
science. Define the
Yeah.
behaviors and then, focus on those behaviors, and then that will lead ultimately to what we're looking to accomplish.
Yeah. And I think it also makes sense because at the end, like no matter what we think, the only thing that changes things in real world is what we do, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
so
very fair point. Exactly.
that's where I also feel like behavioral science is so powerful because it helps to promote the behavior, not the like trying to change some concepts or thinking, but actual things that create results in real world.
Yes, and that's a lot of what I find very attractive and appealing and compelling about it is that, at the end of the day, hopefully we're really driving specific, measurable behavioral changes. And, you know, I think the more we can engage with organizations, the more the more we can help them move in that direction. And also hopefully we can shape the kinds of behavior changes that they're trying to drive. And again, that's where I kind of circle back to this principle of you know, closing intent to action gaps and
Yeah.
thinking less about, let's convince somebody about what they should believe or what they should do, and more like let's start with situations where people want to do something. They want to eat healthier.
Hmm.
They want to speak up when they see something wrong. They want to be more environmentally conscious. They want to be healthier, whatever it may be, and then help find ways to help them accomplish that, making it easier, leveraging
Yeah.
some of these other tools that we have in our toolkit.
Yeah, and speaking of that, making it easier, giving people tools, I think I'd like to ask you this question around very often leaders and, also people in government very often fall into that. I think maybe many of us fall into that. Like we think that communication is the key. Just like, I don't know, tell someone to do thing or make people aware, or shout it louder about it louder and people will just do the thing where I in my profession I've learned to believe that environment and what makes things easier is so much more powerful and incentivizing the right behaviors. Like all these non-communication tools are so much more powerful for changing people's behavior. I guess what
Yeah.
my question is, what did you find in your experience, in your practice, working in so many organizations and on so many levels? Like what works the best? Like is communication as powerful as some people believe? Not like what works better?
No, I'd agree with, I think the premise you were conveying, which is, I mean, obviously it depends a little on the situation, and I'm not going to say communication doesn't matter, but I would say in many of these cases, particularly when people have positive intent, so you're not about convincing them that something matters, but helping them actually act on it.
Yeah.
I think it's much more the timeliness of the communication is the most is arguably as or more important than the communication itself, if that makes sense. In other words, I don't need a lecture about, that cybersecurity is important and I should, do something. I
Yeah.
need a reminder at the moment that I'm making a decision, or going through a process. So, often it's less about crafting a gorgeous manifesto and 5 paragraph email to people about why something matters, because they're just going to nod their head and agree, and more about looking at processes and systems and environments and
Hmm.
finding the right ways to remind them of it when it matters. So that's where I would go. And I guess the other point maybe related to what you're saying is I do think in business in particular, I think processes have a ton of power as well. You building
Hmm.
a message or a pause or something into a process, whatever that may be, a meeting process, a training process, how we do our design briefs or whatever. I think that's incredibly powerful. So you could call that
Hmm.
communication or you could call it more, the other. But I think that's important. And then sometimes, you also have opportunities to build these reminders into environments, whether it's a
Yeah.
physical environment when my computer boots up and I'm signing in and doing something, or physical environment if I'm in an office, just to remind me about whatever it is that I need to be reminded. So again, maybe long-winded, but I'm basically agreeing. I think if anything, we kind of make two mistakes as leaders. One, I think jumping to this conclusion that, people need to be convinced or informed, where in many cases that's not what's missing. That's not what's getting in the way.
Hmm.
And then number two, thinking if I just get the words right and I just write it a little more eloquently and
Yeah.
beautifully, that will make the difference. Whereas again, it's probably more about the timeliness of the communication than its beauty and eloquence and the, wording.
Yeah. It's more about the systems where the action or behavior happens or supposed to happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
such powerful insights. I believe like that's where leaders need to start. Just start thinking more about like what's around people in the moment of decision or when they need to take action. And yeah, start thinking in those terms, not so much around perfect communication, and also just be more behaviorally aware, I guess, when trying to implement different initiatives in the organization, whether that's facing customer or internally.
Yeah, and that's where, again, even just having a few relatively simple tools in mind, kind of this
Yeah,
behavioral lens and this idea of thinking a little more broadly, whether that's COM-B or a different model about barriers and reasons why people
yeah,
may not be doing what we think they should be or what they say they want to be doing. And again, a model, whether it is East or, obviously there are
hmm,
others as well, some of them more sophisticated, to kind of help give us a new set of tools and say, okay,
yeah,
maybe we do need to change our incentive system, but we might also there might be other ways to drive people in the right direction, with that are
yeah,
not necessarily financial.
yeah,
Uh, so yeah, I think, and then part of it may be having a behavioral scientist on the team or part of the
yeah.
process, so you're just kind of making sure you're getting, if it's not in your own head as a leader, you've got someone there that you're checking in with that may give you this additional perspective on a regular basis.
Yes. Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing all these amazing insights and methodologies, ways of applying behavioral science in business to make business more effective and create more positive impact. I guess the last question
Sure.
before we jump off is where could leaders, listeners go to learn more about your work? And maybe additionally, if you have a place for them to where to start, maybe exploring different behavioral science options as applied to business.
Sure. Well, as for me, I publish in a variety of different places. And when I say publish, a few of them are more academic, formal, but a lot of them are 3 page, hopefully more accessible stuff. You can find a good deal of that in under my Medium account. So
Hmm.
if you just Google Scott Young and Medium. You should be able to find me, behavioral
Yeah, we're
science.
gonna link it.
Okay, great. And then also through my LinkedIn, you'll also find a good
Hmm.
number of articles. In terms of where to start beyond that, I'm part of an organization called BESCY. It's
Hmm.
BESCY.org. It's a nonprofit global organization that it was really the main focus is to introduce people to the world of behavioral science and to connect people with an interest in the field, whether they're more sophisticated practitioners or students and so forth. So there are local chapters in some cities, but then there's also some global virtual, meetups. I do one for practitioners group. There are others that are focused on things like sustainability or systems and so forth. So I would really encourage folks to go there just to kind of connect with this field and maybe get pointed in the right direction towards other things. And then, of course, many of the leading consultancies, whether it's Behavioral Insights Team or
Hmm.
Ideas 42 or many others, there's a lot of great content out there in those websites. And there's a lot of great podcasts, including this one, out
Thank
there
you.
as well. So, depending on what people are interested
Yeah.
in, I think one great thing about this field is that people are very generous in sharing, and I
Yeah.
try my best to follow that model as well.
Yeah, that's what I've found. And thank you, Scott, again, for all these recommendations, insight, experience, your time, and your work. So very appreciative. And yeah, keep up great work, and we'll all follow it closely. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure. I hope there's some good nuggets, and I'm really happy to speak to folks individually if they ever want to follow up, so they shouldn't hesitate to do that.
Yes, we'll link
Thanks.
everything, yes, in the show notes. And again, thank you, Scott, for your time.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.